Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi everyone, and welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy, the daily podcast from Takshashila Institution that takes a deep dive into public policy, current affairs, and geopolitical developments. My name is Maya, and I'm an assistant program manager for Takshashila's postgraduate program, or the PGP, in public policy, a comprehensive 48-week program tailored for those aiming to explore both the theoretical and practical aspects of public policy. I'm joined here today by my colleague Leah. Leah, it's a pleasure to have you here on the podcast today. Please take a second to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, Maya. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Leah. I work at the Takshashila Institution as well, and I am the assistant program manager for the Defense and Foreign Affairs course that is a part of our 12-week graduate certificate in public policy program, which also aims to explore the practical and theoretical aspects of public policy, specifically with respect to defense and foreign affairs. Yeah, thanks so much, Maya.
Great. Thanks so much for joining me today. So today we're going to be taking a deep dive into subversive media and how protest movements harness alternative forms of communication. Obviously, this happens all over the globe and there are so many global examples. But for today's episode, we're just going to be looking at perhaps the Indian context. So before we jump into sort of the meat of the conversation, I'd like to take a moment to set the scene a little bit and paint you a picture. So imagine this. It's the early 1940s, and the Indian independence movement has reached its boiling point. British authorities have tightened their grip. They've started banning public gatherings, censoring newspapers. Dissenters are being arrested. But late at night, in a dim room, a small hand-operated printing press hums to life. Sheets of paper stack on top of each other, each one carrying words that the British Raj does not want people to read. These underground newspapers, some examples are the Ghadar, the Harijan, the Kesari, are secretly passed from hand to hand, slipped under doors, hidden inside books, concealed, and circulated. And we can fast forward to 2021, and a very different kind of protest is underway. Hundreds of thousands of farmers, wrapped in layers against the biting Delhi cold, have set up camp on the borders of the capital. And the mainstream media has sort of portrayed them as misled, politically motivated, even violent. But across WhatsApp groups, Instagram pages, and Twitter threads, a completely different story unfolds. A movement called Kisan Ekta Morcha emerges, which is an independent social media platform which was originated and had its genesis with the farmers itself. And so through live streams, viral posts, and real-time updates, they're able to take control of their own narrative and sort of counter this huge wave of disinformation that was being propagated. And we can see that these were really different tools and definitely vastly different times. But if you look closely, the goal is exactly the same. And throughout history, every major protest movement, whether it's big or small, has actually had its own way of getting their message across. This could be through underground newspapers, clandestine pamphlets, or in today's world, as we see, through viral digital social media campaigns. And these alternative channels or formats of communication have often been dismissed as maybe fringe or radical, but we also have to understand that some of the most powerful tools for mobilization, resistance, and community and civic led change. So, Leah, I've been using the term subversive media quite a lot. I wanted to know if you could maybe break that down for us. What exactly is subversive media?
Yeah. So subversive media refers to communication tools like print, digital, or otherwise that challenge dominant narratives, bypass state or corporate control, and serve as platforms for dissent or challenging misinformation. And unlike mainstream media, which is often influenced by political or commercial interests, submersive media is driven by grassroots voices, independent journalism, and community led storytelling, which makes it extremely relevant for spreading information during the time of protest. And alternative forms of media can take many different avatars: handwritten pamphlets, signs, and independent publications, encrypted messaging apps used by protesters to coordinate in real time, and social media accounts that counter state control narratives.
Right. Thank you so much for sort of giving us like a small definition. And now that we have some understanding on what exactly we're referring to, I think it would be nice and worthwhile to spend some time on historical context. And we've already very briefly touched upon the use of print media and sort of the different varieties of underground newspapers that were used during the colonial era, and how this was used to spread very revolutionary messages. So we can go a little bit more into that. So during the independence movement, activists and revolutionaries used a variety of ingenious tactics to bypass the sort of wave of state suppression they were under. And a lot of these tactics were covert and sort of meant to fly under the radar. And the nature of being covert is a very characteristic feature of subversive media, even today. So, some of these ways included hidden and mobile presses. So, British authorities had the habit of frequently raiding printing presses. Suspected of producing anti-colonial literature, and as the movement sort of started heating up, raiding any sort of printing presses, so any sort of information that was sort of coming from the Indian movement. And to counter this, activists established these printing presses in very hidden areas, so basements, abandoned houses, rural areas where perhaps the colonial forces couldn't reach. And if a press was discovered and shut down, as they tended to be, these publications would quickly shift to a new location. And because they were manual or hand operated presses, they could be more easily transported. So, for example, the Ghaddar Party, which published the radical Ghaddar newspaper, operated from different locations to avoid detection. They even sort of exported their printing to the US and then smuggled copies back into India. And these newspapers and pamphlets were often disguised and smuggled through unconventional methods. Anything from being hidden inside sacks of grain or rice, inside hollowed out books, or even stitched into clothing to escape British customs. They will also set up secret distribution networks. This was, I think, personally, when I was reading about this, I found it really interesting because they would sort of leverage their own network, which could include maybe more ordinary people or people who wouldn't be detected, such as railway workers or dock workers and sympathetic postmen who were anyway very mobile and anyway traveled to different parts of the nation. So, for example, Bhagat Singh and his comrades used underground networks to distribute the revolutionary and the people, which called for an armed uprising against colonial rule, and sort of talked about perhaps the use of armed force and how this strategy could work. So, Leah, I wanted to ask if you had any other maybe similar examples that came to mind.
Yeah, actually, I was also thinking of other covert methods that were used in that time. And activists embedded coded messages in seemingly innocuous publications, letters, and editorials to evade direct censorship. And certain phrases, metaphors, or poetry were used to convey anti colonial sentiments without explicitly calling for rebellion. For example, Kesari, which was founded by Bal Gangadhar Tilak, used religious and historical allegories to subtly encourage resistance against the British rule, which is a tactic that made it harder for colonial censors to justify a crackdown. And to
Mhm.
protect journalists and editors from arrest, many wrote under false names of collective identity so that authorities couldn't track them down easily. For example, many of Gandhi's writings in Harijan and other journals were published anonymously or under broad editorial teams to prevent British officials from directly linking them to him. And since many people in rural India couldn't read, written messages were converted into oral forms. So activists memorized articles and recited them in village meetings. During the Swadeshi movement, underground networks would gather in homes or temples to discuss nationalist writings and spread the message further. And finally, since the British controlled many Indian printing presses, activists took advantage of foreign printing presses in places like the US and Germany, Japan, and France. And Subhash Chandra Bose's Azad Hind radio broadcasts and pamphlets were printed in access controlled territories and smuggled into India to fuel resistance.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for that. These are all really great examples. And what strikes me is really the diversity and creativity in which sort of this alternative media found pathways to spread information. Because ultimately, the British understood that revolutionary ideas were spreading much faster than they could control. And this is interesting because it was, the British Empire was huge and their control was so rigid and so far reaching. But in the end, information warfare played a major role in the collapse of colonial rule. So we can see how subversive media really played a critical role in disseminating these ideas during a time of protest, and how important the role of media was in mobilizing the community and spreading these ideas and generally keeping the public inspired. And so, of course, the independence movement is just one of many examples. For me, at least, it's one of the most, perhaps the most obvious and well known one that comes to mind. There's also a lot of information on it available, but there are a lot of other historical examples from across India that demonstrate how alternative media have been leveraged during protests. These are maybe more hyperlocal and regional examples. So, could you tell us a little bit about these other movements, Leah?
Yeah, for sure. So another example is the Naxalite movement from in the 1960s and 70s. And this movement was inspired by a Maoist ideology which used underground pamphlets and self-published magazines to spread radical leftist ideas. And publications like Lal Pataka and Deshbhakti operated outside mainstream media to mobilize peasants and workers against feudal landlords and state forces. And these pamphlets were handwritten, duplicated using simple printing techniques, and distributed discreetly to evade government crackdowns. And despite police surveillance, these materials played a crucial role in creating solidarity among disparate Naxalite factions. Another really great example is the Dalit Panthers movement in the 1970s and 80s. Um, Inspired by the Black Panthers in the US, the Dalit Panthers used self published magazines and newsletters to challenge caste oppression and state violence. Publications like the Dalit Panther critiqued mainstream media's erasure of Dalit voices and documented caste atrocities that were ignored elsewhere. And these periodicals were also introduced revolutionary poetry and artwork, blending political critique with cultural resistance. And the movement's publications not only mobilized valid youth, but also laid the groundwork for later caste conscious journalism. And the final example that I mentioned is the anti-Sikh riots and underground Sikh press 1984 and the aftermath. Following Operation Blue Star, the anti-Sikh riots of 1984, mainstream Indian media largely echoed the government's narrative. So Sikh activists turned turned to underground presses to document state violence, counter disinformation, and communicate within the diaspora. So, secretly printed pamphlets circulated in Punjab and abroad, detailing human rights violations that were otherwise censored. And independent Sikh newspapers in Canada, the UK, and the US played a crucial role in amplifying these voices and building global awareness, illuminating how alternative media can, in fact, become more mainstream media as well. All these examples highlight how, before the advent of digital campaigns, print was very much the medium of dissent.
Right. Thanks so much for that overview. And I think what I gathered from that is if we can say that pamphlets and underground newspapers were sort of the lifeblood and the channel of past resistant movements, then in the contemporary age and digital age, social media is definitely the new pamphlet. This is because it's fast, it's decentralized, and it lets people take control of their own narratives and really provides a sense of agency. And I think that's one of my favorite things about different forms of subversive media. And a great example of this is the farmers' protest in India. This was the largest and longest citizen protest in the world. So, for over a year, farmers camped on the borders of Delhi, demanding the repeal of the three controversial farm laws that were passed. And if you turned on the television or opened a mainstream newspaper, you would have seen a very one dimensional story. Either the protests were completely ignored, there was no coverage, or the protesters were sort of discredited, vilified, or sort of completely put down. And narratives alternately started framing the protesters and the farmers as part of a leftist conspiracy, rioters intent on vandalizing public state property, or even foreign interference seeking to break India, and sort of a foreign collusion. And this sort of stemmed when big international figures like anyone from Rihanna to Kamala Harris to Greta Thunberg started voicing their support. And just to bring in a little bit of theory here, I think this really connects to some of Chomsky's and Herman's writing in their paper Manufacturing Consent, the political economy of the mass media. And they argue that commercial media and communications often conform to the perspectives of the elite because they're trying to sort of satisfy those stakeholders and those stakeholders' opinions. And in response, the farmers devised their own grassroots communication strategy. This was an extremely far-reaching strategy. It span across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, sort of any social media channel you can think of. And the movement was called Kisan Ekta Morcha, which translates to the Farmers' Unity Front. And this sort of emerged as a collective digital platform and served as the movement's unofficial IT cell, one unified place where all this could sort of come from. And it's interesting to think about Twitter as well, because there was a Tractor to Twitter campaign where all of the farmers sort of created Twitter accounts to counter maybe the state-affiliated narratives that were coming up against them. And all three laws were repealed a year after the protests, a real testament to the potential of communication and uplifting suppressed voices and democratizing information. And I think it's interesting to see that there was a really tangible outcome. All three laws were repealed. So this movement in social media and this alternative media actually really granted farmers power, speak directly to the people, bypass maybe the more traditional media gatekeepers, and ultimately get the result they wanted. And this isn't just happening at a national level. It's happening in hyperlocal movements too, which are equally as interesting to look at. So, for example, labor protests and gig worker protests by delivery workers from companies like Swiggy and Zomato, or maybe even Uber and Ola in urban metropolitan cities like Bangalore and Pune, have relied on informal WhatsApp groups to coordinate their strikes, share videos of employer misconduct, and spread awareness. And these aren't necessarily stories you'll see splashed across your primetime evening news, but they spread rapidly through independent media collectives and local networks, which I think are seeing a big sort of resurgence and support right now. And then there's also the case of platforms like the News Minute, the Dalit Camera, and the Wire, and they rely on social media to distribute their content, regardless that maybe they don't have huge amounts of corporate backing or any corporate backing at all, but their work still reaches millions. And another great example that I've been reading about recently is the Kulam anti-nuclear protests. This was back in 2011 to 2012, so quite a while ago. And this was a massive movement led by the local fishermen and villagers in Tamil Nadu. And they were opposing the construction of a nuclear power plant that was being built in the area. And the protests were led by the People's Movement Against Nuclear Energy. This was a really diverse coalition of a lot of different people from different walks of life. So there were local fishermen, there were farmers and agricultural workers, and then there were the villagers and sort of families who lived there. And their primary concern was the safety of the nuclear power plant. It's important to remember that this was in the wake of the Fukushima disaster in Japan, which sort of heightened global anxiety and global consciousness around nuclear energy and the dangers of it. And so the plant was also being built with Russian assistance, and it had been in development since the late 1980s. But the protests peaked in 2011 when the reactors were nearing completion and the plant was sort of about to be started up and launched. And I think the biggest challenge of this movement is that the fishermen and the villagers were not just up against the government, which would have been a big enough undertaking, but also various vested corporate interests and the accompanying media that painted them as anti-development and maybe wedded to maybe a sort of outdated, or some of the media narratives claimed, an archaic way of life. And these were coastal communities, so many of them didn't have access to mainstream news outlets. And even if they did, their voice is definitely being heard. So what did they do? They decided to take matters into their own hands. They started printing pamphlets in Tamil explaining why they were protesting, what the environmental and human safety risks were, and how these risks would really be long term, and why the government's claims weren't adding up. And I think one of the really interesting things about this case study is that they used community radio to spread the message. So fishermen who relied on radio for weather updates and communication at sea suddenly found their daily radios being used as a tool of resistance. And this case study illustrates intersectional resistance really effectively, because we can see how coastal livelihoods, caste dynamics, access to information, environmental justice, and state surveillance all kind of sort of interacted here.
Yeah. And another thing that would be remiss not to mention is that regional language journalism plays a crucial role for us. So while English and Hindi media may dominate the national conversation, it's often in Tamil or Bengali, Assamese or Malayalam that some of the most important grassroots reporting happens in those languages. And these hyperlocal stories, when shared on digital platforms, help expose injustices that could otherwise remain invisible. And this isn't just an Indian phenomenon. We've seen the same digital strategies in the Arab Spring, where Twitter and Facebook helped coordinate protests. In Hong Kong, encrypted apps like Signal and Telegram became essential tools for activists dodging government surveillance. The big takeaway here is that social media has democratized the medium. It has allowed marginalized groups to challenge dominant narratives and mobilize as never before. But at the same time, it's also vulnerable. Governments can shut down the internet, manipulate algorithms, or flood platforms with disinformation. So, as we move forward, the question isn't just how digital activism can empower movements, but also how it can resist digital suppression. And it's just something to think about. Um, it's just what is the future of submersive media and what could it look like when the very platforms it relies on can be used to silence it?
Yes, absolutely. I think you've identified something really important in this conversation, which is sort of the paradox of social media and digital media. It's supposed to, increase accessibility, increase reach, increase, freedom of information, but it's designed in such a way that it can also be used for suppression and censorship. And so I think this discussion has very, sort of naturally led into a concept that's written and researched a lot here at the Takshashila Institution by both our co-founder Nitin Pai and our deputy director Pranay. And that's the concept is that of radically networked societies, or the RNS. And Nitin and Pranay define this radically networked society as a web of hyper-connected individuals possessing an identity, and this could be imagined or real, and motivated by a common and immediate cause. And the defining feature of an RNS is its massive scale of operation. So its wide reach and its ability to evade conventional national security measures. And in the past few years, the past few years, these networks have mobilized massive groups using the power of the internet, because the most important aspect is their speed and scalability. So, in their book chapter, Liberty and Security in Radically Networked Societies, a challenge for every generation, Nitin and Pranay discuss how states find it very difficult to maintain their monopoly over violence due to the speed in networked societies. And because these mobilizations take place in a networked fashion, they're really many times faster than attempts at counter mobilization by sort of the more hierarchically structured authorities who maybe have more bureaucracy, more red tape, more regulations, and more sort of conventions and approvals to follow. So information flows so much more differently in these networks. They spread from node to node through various channels, and each entity in a network can receive, modify, make changes, and transmit this information, limited by only what technology permits. And I think this really is interesting because it allows the nature of information to fundamentally change. And so this framework, I think, applies very well to the farmers' protests that we discussed, and how they created their own radically networked IT cell. Unlike the state's top down communication, that took longer, the farmers' IT network operated in this node to node model, where information was quickly modified, quickly added to, and amplified through different social media users, whether they were on the ground or, completely in different locations. And so this IT cell illustrates the RNS principles perfectly. It helped them outmaneuver censorship, control their own narrative, mobilize resources, and spread the logistics and also the logics of protest faster than the state could move to suppress them. And I'd really encourage you, maybe if all our listeners, to sort of look up these papers on our website, because they go into a lot more detail than I can go into here. And it's really fascinating. Nitin and Pranay don't just discuss the farmers' protests, they discuss a lot of other examples which will sort of give you a better understanding of this concept. Um, yeah, we've talked about how subversive media has evolved and maybe its sort of life cycle, its lifeline, from underground newspapers and pamphlets to the digital age of encrypted messages and viral tweets. But I think what's coming to mind now is, what comes next? Where do we go from here?
Yeah.
And how does subversive media continue to adapt in a world where governments have become more sophisticated in controlling information? And these large tech platforms themselves have started to act as gatekeepers. I wanted to ask if you had any thoughts on this, perhaps.
Yeah. So one of the biggest shifts we're seeing is a move towards decentralization. Instead of relying on mainstream social media platforms, which are increasingly subject to censorship, takedowns, and algorithmic suppression, activists and independent journalists are turning to alternative decentralized platforms. So think about Mastodon, a federated social network that isn't controlled by a single company, or platforms like Matrix and Signal, which provide end-to-end encryption to protect communications from surveillance. And there's also the rise of open source journalism, where groups like the Bellingcat use public data and crowdsourcing to investigate stories that governments don't want to expose. And we also shouldn't forget that the resurgence of print times and independent news networks, like, yes, old school methods are making a comeback because print, ironically, is harder to censor than a tweet that can be deleted in seconds.
Yes, absolutely. So, what is our role in all of this? And from my perspective, I'd say it's to support independent media as much as possible. And you can do this by consciously and actively diversifying where you get your news from. So, maybe not just consuming news from the big platforms, but taking time to sort of seek out these smaller independent sources that are doing real on the ground reporting. And so many have sprung up recently, and they do really good work that actually one can resonate with more. And so one can support independent journalism, whether that's through sort of financial support, maybe subscribing or donating, and if that's not possible, even just sharing their work and amplifying it, because visibility matters. Information is power, and the ability to control narratives, whether by the government, corporations, or social media platforms, has real impact and consequences.
Yeah, and I also want to take a moment to recommend some readings and resources that do a great job of exploring the use of submersive media during protests. So the first would be the Loktantra Underground, the Press in Emergency by Santosh Bhartiya. It's a gripping account of how underground newspapers and secret pamphlets defied censorship during India's emergency from 1975 to 1977. And it highlights the ingenuity of journalists and activists who found ways to distribute suppressed information under constant surveillance.
Mhm.
Then there are the Shaheen Bagh protest designs, such as Shaheen Bagh Ka Guldasta, created and distributed at protest sites during the anti-CAA NRC movement. These signs documented police brutality, the role of women in resistance, and the mainstream media's failure to report on the protest accurately. They serve as a powerful example of how printed media can shape public discourse when mainstream channels fall short. For a more contemporary and localized example, Silent City, Dissent and Censorship in Occupied Kashmir by Zahid Rafiq and Parvez Bukhari explores how journalists and activists in Kashmir have continued to tell stories despite government imposed internet blackouts and surveillance. And the book details how alternative media, whether through covert storytelling or WhatsApp based citizen journalism, has become an essential tool for those resisting state repression.
Yes, thanks, Leah. These resources all sound really interesting. If you're more of a visual learner and enjoy sort of films, there are some amazing short films and documentaries that showcase subversive media in action. And the first one is called The Uprising. It's directed by Peter Snowden, and I think it's definitely one of the most powerful examples. It's constructed entirely and pieced together entirely from citizen shot footage of the Arab Spring. giving an unfiltered first-hand perspective of protest movements that were often misrepresented by mainstream media. And really, it's a really immersive watch. And then for something a little closer to home, Waves of Revolution is a 1975 documentary by Anand Patwardhan, and this was made underground during the Jayaprakash Narayan movement in Bihar. And it captures the student-led protests against Indira Gandhi's regime. And gives us a look into sort of how these student-led protests came about, how they mobilized, what the reaction was. So this is a great watch. And then finally, on a more international level, When a City Rises provides an on-the-ground look at the Hong Kong protests, revealing how these activists relied on Telegram groups, guerrilla filmmaking, and the underground press to fight back against state repression. So these are just some resources you can check out if you're interested. And as we draw to perhaps the end of this conversation, I think what this discussion has helped me reflect upon is that subversive media has always found a way to break through barriers and evolve. It finds different channels, it finds different methods. It's really creative in that sense. And I think it really lends itself to the need of the hour. And in this sort of time when information is so, let's say, accessible, I think subversive media provides us more of a diversified look at different perspectives. And so it's important to think about how subversive media will evolve next and what that process would look like. And more importantly, how we as inherent consumers and creators of media will become part of that evolution. So that's the question and maybe thought I'd like to leave with you as we end this podcast. Thanks so much, Leah, for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Maya, for having me.
Thank you. And to our listeners, we'll see you in the next episode.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.